On the 10th of May 1996, a blizzard descended on the death zone at the peak of Mount Everest, trapping dozens of climbers in the midst of a summit attempt. At an altitude of over 8,000 meters or 26,200 feet, they were dependent on a limited supply of bottled oxygen. And now, in addition, they were exhausted, frozen, and lost in a storm that reduced visibility to zero, eliminated tracks and trails, and made it almost impossible to move. As night set in, it was very apparent that not everyone who had ascended to the roof of the world that day would survive their return down the mountain. There were two large tour groups making a push for the summit of Mount Everest that day, both departing from the final camp on the southeastern route. One group was from the New Zealand company Adventure Consultants, led by 35-year-old veteran climber Robert Hall, and consisting of 3 guides, 8 clients, and 7 Sherpas. The other large group was from the American company Mountain Madness, led by 40-year-old mountaineer Scott Fisher, and consisting of 3 guides, 8 clients, and 8 Sherpas. 38-year-old Anatoli Boukreev was a guide employed by Mountain Madness. Born in the Soviet Union, he spoke relatively poor English, and also had a marked independent streak. He had been reprimanded several times before for not following orders or failing to communicate with the rest of his team. Despite these apparent flaws, Anatoli was an incredible climber and had much to offer in the way of expertise and experience. On the day of the summit push, he reached the peak way ahead of the rest of his group, and then remained there for an hour and a half, helping his clients and others with the final part of their journey. He then turned around and began the climb down to camp, again significantly ahead of the rest of his group. Anatoli did all of this without supplemental oxygen, an incredible feat of endurance and athleticism, given that at the peak of Everest there is just 1/3 of the oxygen you would find at sea level. By the time he returned to camp at 5 p.m. on the 10th of May 1996, he was desperately in need of rest. He returned to his tent, hydrated himself, and slept for a few hours, allowing him to recover from the exhaustion of the climb and the effects of altitude sickness. By the time he woke, the blizzard had descended on the mountain, trapping dozens of climbers on the slopes above. Realizing that they would need help, Anatoli went from tent to tent looking to assemble a rescue party, but found that every other climber present was either exhausted beyond any useful action or suffering extreme ill effects from cold or altitude. Even the reserve Sherpas who had remained at camp in case of an emergency that day were unwell. They had suffered carbon monoxide poisoning after an accident with a stove, and were so severely ill that they were vomiting blood. They could not help with the rescue effort. Anatoli realized that he was the most able person left at camp, and so at 7:30 p.m. he set out on his own into the howling blizzard, hoping against hope that he might stumble across some survivors in the storm. It soon became apparent that this was very unlikely. The weather was against him, he could barely see, couldn't find guide ropes, and struggled to ascend despite now using supplemental oxygen. After an hour of trying, he returned to camp. Later, when a half-frozen gaggle of survivors managed to find their way back to camp at around 11:30 p.m., they were able to advise Anatoli of the location of some of the trapped climbers. Armed with this information, freshly rested and with fresh oxygen, Anatoli set out again for a second rescue attempt. This time, despite facing conditions almost as harsh as he had before, he was successful. He spotted the dim light of a headlamp in the dark, forged his way toward it through the snow, and found a group of survivors. In this group were Adventure Consultants' clients, Beck and Yasuko Namba. 47-year-old businesswoman Yasuko Namba had made the summit on the afternoon of the push, but had thereafter struggled to get down. She was the oldest woman to reach the summit of Everest at that point in time, and was also smaller in stature than many of the other climbers, making her more prone to the effects of the cold. As she descended and the blizzard struck, she became stranded with several others on the south side of the mountain. Yasuko Namba had at least made the summit before being stranded. Beck Weathers, on the other hand, had not got that far. The 49-year-old pathologist from Texas had managed the ascent to the final camp high up on the slopes of Everest without major incident. But at this extremely high altitude, he had begun to suffer. He had, some years ago, had an eye operation that weakened his corneas, and as the group reached higher and higher altitudes, his vision grew more and more limited. By the day of the summit push, he could barely see at all. Not wishing to quit when the goal of a months-long trip was so tantalizingly close, Beck managed the first part of the summit push simply by sticking close to the person in front of him and stepping where they stepped. As the sun rose, however, his vision worsened still further, and he was forced to admit that he could barely see. Expedition leader Robert Hall considered sending him back down to camp with a Sherpa, but Beck asked to be allowed to wait and see if his sight improved once the sun was higher in the sky. Robert agreed, and instead of sending Beck back to camp, he left him at a midway point on the slopes of Everest to be picked up when the group descended. Beck's eyesight did not improve, and he waited where he had been left for several hours. When the blizzard swept in, he became trapped in place, unable to see twice over through his failing eyes and through the driving snow. Robert Hall would die without returning to collect Beck Weathers. Instead, Beck was found by another adventure consultant's guide, Michael Groom, who took him some way down toward camp on a short rope before they too became stuck along with several other climbers. When the weather slackened at nearly midnight, some of this group made a break for camp. Left behind were Beck Weathers, Yasuko Namba, 38-year-old Mountain Madness client Charlotte Fox, 41-year-old Mountain Madness client Sandy Hill, and 33-year-old Mountain Madness client Tim Madsen, all of them suffering from cold, exhaustion, and altitude in one way or another. Yasuko's condition was particularly acute. She struggled to follow instructions, repeatedly putting on her oxygen mask despite being out of oxygen. Soon, she was barely conscious, her hands outside of her mittens and frozen. It looked to the others as though she stood little chance of surviving. This was the state of affairs when Anatoli Boukreev finally stumbled upon the group. Anatoli realized that, given the conditions, he would have to walk each of the survivors back to camp one by one. He first took Charlotte, promising that he would return for Beck, Yasuko, Sandy, and Tim. Before he could return, Beck, freezing cold, blind, and perhaps confused by hypoxia, stood up and announced, "Hey, I've got this all figured out." Then, without further explanation, he disappeared into the night. Those left hunkered on the ice could only presume they had just watched a man walk to his death. Agonizing minutes later, Boukreev did return. By this time it was clear that Yasuko was beyond saving, and Beck was lost to the night. Anatoli walked Sandy back to camp with Tim following in his footsteps as best he could. The three reached camp, alive, if only barely. Incredibly, Beck survived off the trail and unguided in the heart of the blizzard. He made his way back to camp alone, arriving the next day. By the time he stumbled into camp, he looked beyond saving. His extremities and much of his face were black from frostbite, and his hands were so badly affected that a surgeon would later call them the hands of a dead man. He was unable to eat or drink and could barely move. His fellow climbers fully expected him to die within hours, and made him as comfortable as possible. They were startled when he lived through the night. The next day, they helped him walk down the mountain step by agonizing step, until he was low enough to be evacuated by helicopter. He lost many of his fingers and his right arm to frostbite, along with most of his nose. But, against all odds, Beck Weathers survived. He was, in many respects, lucky to do so. In total, 8 climbers died on the slopes of Mount Everest during the blizzard. They were Adventure Consultants Guide Andrew Harris, Adventure Consultants Client Doug Hansen, Adventure Consultants Group Leader Robert Hall, Adventure Consultants Client Yasuko Namba, Mountain Madness Group Leader Scott Fisher, and 3 members of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police who had been attempting the summit in a separate expedition on the northern route up the mountain. Tsewang Spandler, Naik Dorj Morap, and Tsewang Paljo. This group had arrived at the summit very late in the day when the blizzard had already started, and though sighted on the way down, could not be found by searchers. What is thought to be the body of Tsewang Paljo remains in place on the trail up Everest. It is now a grisly landmark, recognizable by his distinctive green boots that climbers pass on their way to the summit. In the aftermath of the disaster, Mountain Madness guide Anatoli Boukreev was criticized for some of his actions in the lead-up to the disaster. Some expert climbers said that he should have stuck with his group at all times and should have taken supplementary oxygen even if he believed he could manage without it. Even his critics, however, allowed that once the disaster had begun, he had acted with incredible courage and had saved several lives, something he might have been unable to do if he had not rested when he did. Overall, the expeditions were criticized for poor leadership, for bad decision-making, and for encouraging underprepared and underinformed climbers to tackle one of the most dangerous mountains in the world. It was notable that, despite this disaster representing one of the worst single losses of life in the history of Everest, the 1996 season as a whole saw fewer deaths than the average. Even at the very best of times, even without a mass disaster, the summit of Everest is a compelling but utterly deadly goal.